Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be back at the IFS. I haven't been here for a couple of years now, but it's always a great pleasure to come and be part of the events that are organised, and this one to me highly pertinent so soon after Trident Juncture. Let me say the first thing this afternoon is although I am from NATO headquarters, I'm not speaking for NATO, particularly with that thing live streaming over there. So I have to be a little bit careful than I perhaps would normally be in all this. But I've been asked to say a few words on where we are in terms of reinforcement and the status of reinforcement from a NATO perspective. But before I do that, let me also join Peter Roberts in commending the article that was written ahead of this seminar by Robin Allers and Paul Hilder. And I agree with their conclusion that overall the glass is half full, but I also agree with Peter Roberts that there is still some way to go in all of this. Now, reinforcement is a key element of readiness and responsiveness. It was also a key outcome from the Brussels summit this year, one of the issues that was there, and will be a key issue for defence ministers who are going to pick this up again in February next year. So let me just come back then very briefly to readiness and reinforcement, which was one of the main elements that came from the Readiness Action Plan. Now, within all of that, we described readiness as trained, organised, sustainable forces held at notice to move. And sustainable forces was they had all their equipment, they had all the logistics that allowed them to be able to operate for a certain period of time. It did not address scale of forces as such. It addresses individual units that are held appropriate under those circumstances. Now, readiness is all about having those forces at the right place at the right time, which is, responsiveness is all about having those forces at the right place at the right time, which is something different. And as is mentioned in the Cold War years, we were ready and we were responsive because we were all living in Germany, 600,000 of us very close to the inner German border. We had all the stocks and things we needed with us, and we trained every year for the fight we thought we might have to have. But things are different now, and decision-making described by the last panel, where I agree with almost everything that was said and disagree with some of it as well, we need to remember that through the last 30 years within NATO, all our decisions have been taken in relation to what I describe as discretionary operations of choice beyond our borders, where we have owned the timeline. We decided when we were going to Kosovo, when we were going to Afghanistan, when we were going to do things in Libya, and we also decided when we'd had enough and it was over. Now, the problem we face today is an adversary who owns the timeline, and it's a question of whether our processes are adequate for that. You've had the pros and cons from the last panel. What I can tell you is that there is the notion of whether our processes are suitable for decision-making in a collective defence environment, are right or wrong, is being studied in Brussels, and towards the middle of next year, it will be considered. From my perspective, and again this was discussed, we still seem to see a binary process between peace, crisis, and conflict, whereas the Minister of Defence quite rightly pointed out we do not have start and stop dates. In this hybrid world we live in, and I agree with the term, I don't like hybrid warfare as a term, but we live in a hybrid environment. We are somewhere today between peace and conflict, and not entirely sure where it is because someone else is running that particular timeline. So decision-making is all important in that context, and it's timely decision-making that I talk about, not rapid decision-making. You can take a rapid decision at the wrong time and it's no good to you, or a slow decision in time and it is absolutely right for you. Beyond that, it's then what we're talking about in terms of the forces in all this. It is the deployment timelines as much as anything else that's going to get them, how long it's going to take them to get to where they need to be responsive. And this notion of notice to effect rather than notice to move that was described earlier. And notice to effect to me is all about creating the scale of force you need as well as getting it in terms of getting it into the fight. So there is this notion of some kind of training period if our forces are not designed at scale from the outset. Now, our posture today in NATO is, in policy terms, very deliberately, we start with the national home defence forces in the countries such as Norway, the Baltic states, and in some cases boosted by forward presence in the Baltic states and to a degree down in the southeast in Romania as well. Then we come into the reinforcement aspect, and the first reinforcements are the VJTF, then the rest of the NATO response force, some 40,000 in terms of numbers, and then the follow-on forces which come from nations which are held at varying notices to move and not at any notice to effect as things currently stand. And this does raise issues, and one of those issues was just identified there. The VJTF, the NRF, at 40,000 strong, is a one-shot force. So once that is deployed, it is then the follow-on forces that should be available to SACEUR which come into play. And they are at a variety of notice to move. They're at a variety of distances, clearly the furthest away being the ones we want most from North America. And they are, many of them, do not know now where it is they're going to go to if conflict or crisis occurs. In my military career, when I was serving in Germany, very easy. I knew exactly where my trench was going to be, somewhere near the inner German border. We used to go and check it every year to make sure the Germans hadn't built a pub or something on top of it over that period. When I was serving in the UK, the units I belonged to knew exactly where they were going to go to. So we were training to do that. Today, those forces who do not know where they're going do not know what they're training for. And that is a serious upshot as far as from a military perspective. And all this comes from the political debate that is going on about regional focus and regionalization, whether it's desirable where we should have it, and also this notion of national ownership of small forces where you cannot afford in peacetime to commit. But that does, as a consequence, provide significant planning challenges for NATO. It challenges the agility of this new NATO command structure that is being created now, one which is wholly reliant on relationships with NATO force structure headquarters, the force structure being the forces owned by allies, and the headquarters that come from that force structure, which must complement the command structure headquarters to create a command and control spectrum from the tactical to the strategic. So with all this, the February Defence Ministers next year will discuss reinforcement. And there's three key things or elements of that which are out there. Firstly, the maritime posture that has just been alluded to, this notion of can we control the sea lines of communication, particularly across the North Atlantic, but others as well. There is also the alliance military reinforcement concept, which is being produced by the military authorities for political agreement, and the readiness initiative that again has been alluded to by many. Now, the good news about the readiness initiative is it is talking about notice to effect, and it's talking about creating scale. So it is not just 30 individual units available in 30 days. So with all that, what did Trident Juncture demonstrate from my perspective in terms of reinforcement? And I was lucky to come up here with the Distinguished Visitors Day, the first time I've ever been a distinguished anything, from NATO headquarters at the end of October. Well, firstly, to me, it did show that reinforcement can be done. We did deploy significant forces from across the North Atlantic. We did deploy significant forces from other parts of the alliance. So where there is a will, there is a way. And in all this, in my view, Norway has been rightly applauded for both hosting that exercise and the level of effort that Norway put into it in terms of their total defence concept. There are lessons, the lessons that will come out of Trident Juncture, for me, are principally those that fall into the logistic bracket rather than anything to do with the can we fight bracket. Significantly, in August this year, when it was fairly quiet in NATO, and I was perusing the NATO website, there was a picture of Italian equipment arriving in Norway for exercise Trident Junction. Now, this to me was 100% something I could identify with. It takes that length of time to get forces to move from a country such as Italy into a strategic distance to Norway through the Mediterranean, Atlantic and North Sea, and then to be able to do that integration training to create the scale that I have talked about. This is, again, I was part of the UK planning effort for deployment to Gulf War I in 1990, and it's exactly what happened then, that notion of having to have that lengthy deployment time and that lengthy integration time before you were ready for the fight. This, to me, then comes back to the timeliness of decision-making rather than the rapidity of decision-making. So deployment timelines, absolutely fundamentally important. Of note, of course, the nations coming to the exercise came into one country, into Norway. Nations arriving into Western Europe from across the Atlantic or driving up from Spain, Portugal, however else they may deploy, are going to go through many countries. Now, I know the session tomorrow is going to pick up on the issues related to military mobility, but it is not just roads, railways, waterways, airports, seaports. It is national legislation on cross-border movement and other issues which are still to be resolved. So we did not test the notion of coming into Belgium, moving through Germany, Poland, and into the Baltic states at all. These things have been practiced in recent years and have taken far longer than anyone anticipated they would do for a whole variety of reasons. And of course, everything was done in a benign environment. We've alluded to the point we do not necessarily have the days of supply of ammunition and other combat supplies that are needed. Allies are addressing that. There were no heavy casualties, so we were not testing anyone's medical system, be it the military or into the civil system at all. And of course, we were doing all this in an absolute benign environment. Whereas our knowledge now of what is called the anti-access area denial capabilities of Russia would have impacted or could have impacted our ability to move from the east coast of America all the way through to Norway, and certainly could do exactly the same in moving through Western Europe towards Poland and the Baltic states if Russia so chose to do so. So I think reinforcement, making progress, still some way to go. We've got to get the right lessons from Trident Juncture so we can apply them through to the future as well.